year for this event, Disability as Power. This event is a companion program to the James Stewart Deaf Republic exhibit that's currently at the Ross Art Museum. And this exhibit is based on Ilya Kaminsky's award-winning poem, which begins when a young deaf boy inspires a town's resistance to a violent military occupation. Both book and exhibit are a remarkable allegory in which disability is reimagined as a source of power. So if you haven't seen the exhibit, I'd invite you to come see it in person or see it online through our website. It's up through March 20th. So while the Kaminsky poem offers a jumping off point for the exhibit, we envision today's panel as a bit more expansive. For this event, we will have 3 respected scholars of disability join us to explore how traits labeled disabilities can also be personal, social, and cultural sites of challenge, strength, and change. This event is a collaboration, so I want to take a minute just to thank everybody who's been involved in putting it together. The Accessibility Services Office and Stephanie Rowland, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council at Ohio Wesleyan, the Office of the Chief Diversity Officer, and Don Chisebe, our Chief Diversity Officer. I also want to thank Dr. Ashley Biser, Associate Professor of Politics and Government at Ohio Wesleyan, for agreeing to serve as our moderator. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Biser to introduce our panelists.
Thanks. It's so great to have everyone here. I'm really excited for tonight's panel. We're joined today by 3 different speakers. I'm going to start with Dr. Kim Nielsen, who's the Chair of Disability Studies, at the University of Toledo, and a Professor of Disability Studies, History, and Women and Gender Studies. We're also joined by Dr. Ali Day, who is Associate Professor of Disability Studies at the University of Toledo, and then also by Dr. Debanuj DasGupta, who's Assistant Professor of Feminist Studies at UC Santa Barbara. And so I'm really excited to be here and to learn from these panelists who are going to offer us the opportunity to learn a little bit more about disability scholarship and activism. As we sort of go into the panel, we want to call attention not only to the sort of scholarship that we are going to get to learn about, but also to the lived experience of those with disabilities, many of whom might be joining us today. And so if you have any difficulties accessing either the transcription or seeing the interpreters, please send Erin Fletcher a message and she will work to make sure that the panel is as accessible as it can be. And so we want to, part of the sort of impetus for this panel, as Erin said earlier, is to draw attention to the ways in which what is perceived as a challenge can also be a site of strength and change. And so what we're going to do is start with me asking our panelists a few questions and then move on to have the opportunity for audience questions. As we go on, if you have something that you'd like the panelists to address, please feel free to add it to the chat at any time. Erin Fletcher will be monitoring the chat and will help us sort of keep track of questions as they arise. So for our panelists, I just want to say thank you everyone for being here. I'm really excited for our conversation, and I think we'll sort of get started now. So what I thought we might do to get us started is to talk just a little bit about definitions of disability, since obviously this is a highly contested concept. And so I was wondering if each of you might talk a little bit about how you define disability in your work. Maybe I'll start with you, Kim, if you don't mind.
Certainly, and hello, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for the organizers for this together. Yeah, this is the rub, right? And this is the difficult question that all of us struggle with. I'm a historian, so I define everything historically. You know, the standard definition that I at least start with and wrestle with is that disability is the ways of being, both body and mind, body-mind, that are considered non-normative at a certain time period and are often stigmatized. And I guess my point as a historian is that always, of course, changes over time and culture and space. To somebody else.
This is Ali speaking. I'll jump in. Our students often ask us those questions, like in intro to disability studies. They're like, well, sometimes I think until a couple of years ago when word really got out about what we do in disability studies, before that, I think students would sign up for a class and they would expect to see like a week on autism, a week on blindness, a week on deafness, and it was like diagnostic categories. And I would always say, you know, that's not what you got into here. And then the question would always emerge over the next couple of weeks of like, but what is a disability? And does this count as a disability? And when I'm out in the world and people learn that I teach about disability or I do disability studies, they often will say, oh, that's like really nice. Does this count as a disability? Or is this a disability? Or, you know, my friend with autism, XYZ. And so my response is always, well, what's your context? In what context? Are you talking about whether or not you're eligible for SSI? Are you talking about whether or not you're part of a protected class of people so that you could file a claim about discrimination? Or are you talking about personal identity? Like somebody identifies as having a disability or as being disabled because they have a body mind that's unanticipated by the larger society.
Thanks, Sally. Debanuj, would you like to add into that?
Hi, I'm Debanuj, and it is, first of all, I want to thank for inviting me and, you know, to be in this forum, to see Dawn and Ali, my grad school besties, to be in this space, in this virtual space with colleagues without whose support, who enabled me as a crib body to finish my PhD program, right? I would not be here on my second job. I wouldn't have imagined this future when I was struggling to finish a candidacy exam, like writing an answer. So what I consider as disability in my teaching and sort of the, you know, epistemological systems through which I engage with disability would be, you know, through life experience. And secondly, if I can go to a different level of abstraction through my life experience, is to think as disability as a form of power relations through which certain norms construct certain bodies or render me disabled. So it's this, you know, and I go to geographers of disability such as Pamela Moss, you know, I'm trained in geography, to think about how space and place is sort of working in tandem with like the material ways in which power relations are manifesting around my body that renders me disabled, right? Renders certain bodies as disabled. So in this kind of locational specificity, I would think of disability as society disabling bodies, rather than starting from I am disabled or like what is disability as this diagnostic mode that Ali's talking about.
Thank you. I was wondering, Debanuj, if you could go into a little bit more about how understandings of disability might differ across cultures so that we can have sort of a broader understanding of the context, I think, Ali, that you were talking about, of how when that context shifts sort of cross-culturally, how people's understandings of disability also shift.
Well, you know, culture is it's a slippery terrain, right? And to think culturally is a slippery terrain. But to think through, let's say, different meaning systems of, you know, of even the term, you know, sort of of disability, right? So if I want to think through a different language, if I want to think through Bengali, which is my mother tongue, there really isn't a word for disability. You know, there is a word for different kinds of quote unquote disability. So andho related to sight, kana, boba related to, you know, hearing and visuality. And so there are different terms around which we can think about different capacities of the body, but there really isn't a term up until the nationalist project and we get to Indian independence. We get this sort of modernist construction called Drirobodhir, as in its literal translation of disability, right? So somehow for me, disability as a term is always tied to the question of the nation state and also to a broader project of like sexual modernity, bodily modernity, right? Like in order to be arriving as a disabled subject, I have to have a relationship of citizenship or not with the nation state. Thus the nation state or society is reading me or not reading me, giving me recognition or ability or not, right? So culturally speaking, in that sense, situating like linguistically, a different sort of ontology of disability would be words that gesture towards bodily capacity and doesn't assemble around a modern scientific theory of the body. It assembles in a very different way, right? It assembles around senses, around haptic. And so hence we get the formation of certain differently abled bodies. So if I have a different visual capacity, the idea becomes I might have some magical power, and magical power of sensing, magical power of hearing. I might have a magical power. It coheres around different sort of capacities, and then reading different capacities with different kinds of cosmological powers, cosmological narratives of capacity. Doesn't really cohere into a scientific narrative of the body. Am I making sense? Did I get to it? Sorry, I had a cappuccino and in my grad seminar and coming out of it. So, my bipolar brain is like going in multiple directions, but hey, we can work that out here, right?
No, that's really helpful. And I actually want to pick up a little bit on that question of citizenship and the ways in which our understandings of citizenship have been tied to different conceptions of which bodies are disabled and which are not. And so, Kim, I was going to turn this over to you based on your disability history of the United States and ask if you could talk a little bit about that sense of how our understandings of what it means to be a model citizen, a model American shift and affect our conceptions of disability.
Sure, thank you. And thank you, Debanuj, and that you really, I think, set a groundwork for us to talk about this really well. So I am a US historian, and that is the geography of which I know best. And I in no way want to claim that this is the same everywhere. But I think particularly in US history, we have such a grounding. The US was a grand experiment at the beginning. Nobody knew if democracy was going to work, and democracy presumes that people have capacity to make good decisions to vote. And, from the very beginning of the nation state, the question of who had capacity to vote was continually, right, and continues to be contested all these decades, centuries later. So I think from the very beginning of talking about the nation state, the question was who had capacity to vote, and in that way, ideas about disability, gender, race, landedness, all became entangled, and lots of folks were thus disqualified from citizenship because of what was considered a lack of capacity, and I think that's one way in which the story of disability continues throughout all of US history, as we have these constant conversations of who has capacity to vote, who has capacity to be in public, to present ideas in public spaces, to create, to enter government, to be a citizen. That is the story. And I think one way in which, as I said, disability is central.
I would say too, I mean, to think about how in the United States and in Western Europe, because we're actually going back to Enlightenment thinkers and folks like John Locke, we have to understand that like we founded this great experiment of democracy based on an understanding of capacity to labor and capacity to labor predictably, right? So to produce a predictable outcome from your body, right? And so we brought those, white people from Western Europe brought those ideas, and those became the foundation for sort of documents that the US nation state was sort of based on. And a lot of folks like Marxist theorists like Martha Russell like would say disability is a direct effect of capitalism, right? The idea that you need to have an expendable population in order for capitalism to work and for a constant accumulation of goods to continue to happen. And I know like people who think about the social contract, like Stacy Simplican Clifford, have talked about the capacity contract as sort of foundational. Like we think about citizenship through our fear of being left out of the process of citizenship. We're always afraid that we're going to lose our cognitive capacities, and it's that fear that sort of roots us in the nation state project. And I was, when we were just thinking about capacity, I mean, I've taught a lot last semester about the Britney Spears guardianship, right, case that was unfolding before our very eyes as the semester went on. And what people in my class didn't realize, I think a lot of people don't realize, is that guardianship laws or conservatorship laws, depending on what state you're in, is what they're called, vary state by state. We have no oversight over them. We don't have a way to litigate them in a lot of places. And when you're put under guardianship or conservatorship, which is often actually just a result of turning 18 and having an IEP, and like parents don't even know that that's what happened, you lose your right to vote, right? So once I like explain to students, like, you actually literally lose your right to vote when you are under this kind of guardianship, then all of a sudden the implications start to seem like a lot more like, oh, this really is an issue of human rights, right? It's actually about how much you can participate in democracy. And so we're still wrestling with that, right? Britney's case is still unfolding. But I think that was a useful opportunity for us as a culture to think about that.
Thanks for that, Ali. Oh, Kim, you were going to go ahead.
Yeah, one way I think that the US is at least relatively unique is the US obsession with independence. And the presumption that disability means dependency and that non-disabled people are completely independent, right? Which, if we think about this is a myth, but independency is the myth that much of the US is grounded on. And none of us are truly independent. We're all highly interdependent, dependent, and that changes constantly throughout our life. But I think that emphasis upon independence and the fear and almost the despisal of dependency is relatively unique to the US context.
Thanks. I was wondering also if you could talk a little bit more about the ways in which well, so I'm thinking back, Ali, to your point about the capacity contract by Simplican, and that she's obviously drawing that idea off of other folks who've written about the ways in which our understandings of social contract theory are premised on certain forms of exclusion, the racial contract, the gender. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about the concept of disability in relation to other forms of identity and the intersections that we see there, as well as sort of what diversity looks like within the disability community.
We're all the same in the disability community. We all agree on the exact same things. There's no, we all drank the Kool-Aid. I think if I can jump in with like sort of one way to sort of think about this from my research. So when I was doing field research with women living with HIV in Central Ohio, I went in with a question of how do you relate to disability as an identity? Is that an identity that you can relate to? And everyone that I spoke with and interacted with over the course of a year of doing these sort of reading groups with them, somehow negotiated with disability, quote unquote entitlements, right? Whether it was Social Security or leave or whatever it might be. Or in one case, one woman was actually filing a lawsuit based on the ADA for discrimination. But none of the people I worked with identified as being disabled. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about that. Okay, well, why not? Why don't you identify as being disabled? And in our conversations over a long period of time, it became apparent that disability meant, in this cultural context, an inability to work in the future, right? So not being able to work in the future was what disabled meant. And everyone that I was working with, even if they weren't quote unquote working, right, in the formal economy at that moment, understood themselves as being able to participate in work in the future, and therefore they weren't disabled. And so I started to really think about how disability is actually something that comes as an effect of privilege, right? That disability is actually an effect of white privilege. It's an effect of male privilege. It's an effect of sort of being presumed to have a certain capacity in the first place, and the ways in which people who don't fit some of those privileged categories negotiate disability all the time with this really sophisticated kind of consciousness. And I really worked with Shayla Sandoval's work to sort of think about what that means, to have this sort of differential consciousness in relation to disability identity. But that's what I sort of discovered, was that like disability is not equally available as an identity for all people, right? It really comes as like an effect of how you're being called out, right? By who constructs it, if that makes sense.
Does anyone else want to speak to that?
So this is so exciting. It reminds me of a graduate seminar Ali and I were in together. In Central Ohio. I shall not name the university, but let's just say in Central Ohio. So, I mean, I often think of, so as somebody living with HIV, right? I'm a long-term survivor of HIV. Sometimes HIV falls off my everyday life. It just becomes this routine habit of taking my medication and continuing with my daily life, because in the everyday life, sometimes it doesn't show up in the same vein Ali is talking about, as sort of a consciousness of disability, right? But what often happens is when I am traveling internationally, I'm often gone on rejoicing things. Like I had an SSRC fellowship, how amazing for my academic career. I was supposed to be gone for 9 months doing field work, right? And I would have to negotiate with the insurance industry to get, more than 30 days supply, to get my 90 days supply. And it's great if you get your 90-day supply, but what if you're going away for 8.5 months, right? And so it has often worked in a way where other colleagues, and then to work, often to work at a major R1 is constructed as such an academic privilege, right? But then you take crib bodies and you throw us in locations of R1s that are either very expensive, such as where I am right now, or where I was in the middle of the woods, is that it's very difficult to build communities of survival, right? So let's just go back to the story, and where my colleagues previously would, pick up my meds, that the local pharmacy came to know me and gave me some respect as a professor. And I was able to use this cultural access and cultural capital to convince them to give my meds to my colleagues, right? And they would mail it with some book, very inanely it would arrive. And now hop, skip, and jump, we're in the middle of COVID pandemic that has created a newer set of public health regulations and examinations of transnational postal order system, right? So my colleague here, my new colleague here, picks up my meds, in good gesture says, these are HIV meds, that's really important, this reaches on time, and sends it through FedEx to India. And we both think, well, okay, let's think as, through efficiency, FedEx works better than government mail system. It'll be safe, Indian mail system, things get lost. And I get a notice from FedEx, from Indian customs, that I would have to pay a huge amount of taxes. I would have to get a KYC number, which is an Indian consumer's number. And so when I call up this KYC number place, and when I call FedEx, angry with FedEx and asking them, why is this required? I have never been required of this. They explained to me the Indian government treats them as a private corporation. A private corporation sending contraband medications, because India and the United States is in a patent war with each other over HIV medications. India hasn't signed the global patent agreement. So sending not generic medication, but sending, labels and over through a private corporation to somebody in India then becomes a questionable act. In fact, being read through the lens of national security and bioterror in a moment of the pandemic. So unbeknownst to me, I had become a bioterror again. And I was then reminded I am HIV positive. Again, I was reminded, and it doesn't matter that I worked hard through this capabilities approach to become a professor, access health insurance, and have one of the best health insurances in the country through the state of California. It really didn't matter in that case. So I had to go back to the Indian market and the Indian medical system to buy generic drugs at the cheapest price ever I will buy my HIV medications, but the same substance, because India hasn't signed an international patent agreement with the United States. So Cipla produces the same HIV drugs in India and actually is the biggest provider of HIV meds to Brazil and most African countries at an effective price. So I'm laying out my narrative to show how my body is disassembled. And, including with these meds were also my bipolar meds. And there was a period of 10 days where I had to go without both my medications till I was able to buy medications at an Indian price. So literally, the chemical composition of my body is reassembled, disassembled, assembled again through these biopolitical, geopolitical moments. That for me is the incommensurability of a quote unquote disabled body's citizenship status with the capacity to function, quote unquote, the capacity to function. The capacity to function, which Ali and Kim have brought out, the capacity to vote, the capacity to function as sort of the hook for citizenship, is incommensurable for diverse bodies with different abilities. And it shifts, as our historian friend has shown here, it shifts through pandemics, it shifts through geopolitical moments and locations. I'll stop there.
Thank you. So I want to sort of shift our attention a little bit away from kind of definitional questions, although obviously they are important, to think a little bit more about the ways in which, even despite the many different ways that people understand themselves in relation to the identity of disability, what are some of the ways in which they've come together in forms of activism and other efforts to try to push for change to make life better for those who have disabilities?
I'll jump in. So it's a really big question. What are some ways? So project that I'm working on, the best way for me to talk about some of these questions is just sort of talk about the projects I'm working on. So a project that I'm working on here in Toledo, Ohio, has to do with an HIV hospice that was here in town. It opened in 1989, had its first resident in January of 1990. And it sustained itself for 13 years through very, very tiny grants and largely through the Catholic Church and drag bar donations, right? So for 13 years, they were one of the longest running HIV hospices around. And what's really interesting is that the HIV community did not engage in any way with the disability justice or disability rights community here in town. So Toledo has a independent living center that's been around for 100 years. There are people, you would think that at that time there would have been overlap in terms of coalition building between those two groups, right? And in some papers, I even find that the recently retired director, who was not the director at the time, right, young worker of the ILC, like came and did an access audit of the house that they were getting. They had a old rectory donated to them from the diocese. So we knew that they knew about each other, but there was no engagement and coalition with one another. We also know that one of the impetus for forming the organization was this new local hospice group, right? And the hospice group was like, we have this need and we can't serve them. So what can we do? And so there was actually almost an antagonism between the two groups, right? And that is really frustrating for me as like a queer crit person to be like, man, why couldn't you guys have seen how you could have like helped each other like so much, right? But there was like a politics of respectability coming from the ILC, right? And then there was this sort of sense of like, well, we're not disabled, right? We're people living with AIDS, or we're people living with HIV, or we're people dying with AIDS, right? In the earlier days. So there wasn't a moment for a coalitional possibility. But what's really interesting is that we're working on this film project to tell the story of David's house. And in sort of following the paperwork and doing all these oral history interviews of 13 years worth of community knowledge, you see that there is coalition at a very, very tiny scale, right? So that you see Catholic nuns becoming the best friends of like this one owner who owned one of the bigger drag clubs in town, Caesar Show Bar, like they became sort of best friends, right? And so you see these moments of coalitional possibility that emerge through this place of David's house. So and sometimes when you're thinking about disability history or just thinking about coalitional moments, there's deep disappointment because when looking back on something, you can sort of see all the losses and sort of not coming together. And it seems so clear, you know, to you looking back, like this is such a missed opportunity. But then when you sort of peel back the layers, there's coalition happening in different ways. And it's been really interesting doing this film during COVID because we're learning about actually how people took care of one another in a time of deep recession, deep economic recession. Toledo is not a rich town, right? It's a very rusty town. There's not a lot of resources here. And so the fact that this community did it and Columbus couldn't make it happen, right? Columbus, Ohio could keep an HIV hospice open for 9 months and that's it, right? So like that's sort of the kind of thing that you start to like sort of unveil when you peel back the layers and look at sort of the experiential history out there.
I love that example, Allie, because it shows both as I was trying to remember the words you used, right? The moments that are both agonizingly painful and have a whole lot of promise and potential and actually realized potential in them. Yeah, and I guess I just love that example. And I think, you know, I would offer just building on that really specific example, which I think is so illustrative, you know, to look at the big thing. In the US, prior to World War II, well, there have always been disability activism, and we can define activism in a whole lot of ways, but that has always been the case of disabled people attempting to improve their own lives and work together with others to do so. Prior to World War II, it was all nearly all diagnostically specific. Okay, and this notion of a cross or pan disability, and sometimes cross race, cross gender disability identity, cross sexuality, cross region, just didn't happen. It was nearly all very specifically diagnostic and sometimes very racially and gender segregated activism. And it's really just since World War II that has begun to spread out, which really is not that long ago. And I think we're still disability activists and we as a community are still wrestling with the question of how do we then not only go cross diagnostic identities, which I think the disability community is sometimes good at and sometimes not, but also then to think much more broadly around other identities in activism.
I was just thinking of like another example that I used last week as Russia was invading Ukraine, right? And I went to my Disability American Literature course and I was like, how can I talk about this? Because I need to talk about this. It's happening. I've had, the BBC in my ear for 3 hours. Like I need to talk about this, but it's not really related to anything that we're doing in this class. And so I just said like, who's thinking about this? And, it was variations of, and I said, well, there are several ways that I'm thinking about this as a disability justice issue. That's on my radar as a disability justice activist. And so I spent time talking with them about how war, of course, I mean, this is maybe the most clear or obvious example, but war is one of the most disabling things out there, right? It creates disability among soldiers and civilians, right? Both physical disabilities and long-term trauma-related disabilities, right? It also disables the environment, right? And creates disabling conditions in the environment for years and years to come. But it also creates migrants, right? Which is another disabling system. And then it also creates, it destroys health infrastructure. And when you have a virus, viruses love it when you destroy a health infrastructure because then they get to travel and mutate and become even more difficult to deal with, right? And we know this because we used to think we took care of polio and polio has reemerged in places like Afghanistan, right? So what's going to happen with something like COVID? Like this is a global health crisis, which is a disabling crisis, right? And just to get my students to think about, oh my gosh, Ukraine is something that I should care about. I thought about it as like, oh, it's a shitty thing, but I don't have any business commenting or getting involved, or like, I'll just support those people that have a direct stake in it, but it's not my business, right? And so I think having people think really broadly about what it means to build coalition and think about the stakes can really help the disability justice community like do bigger work, right?
Thanks for that. Kim, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about disability studies sort of as a discipline and sort of where it comes from, where it's going. Some questions, obviously those are large questions, but sort of just in terms of as we're thinking about the institutionalization of disability studies, particularly on college campuses, places like that. If you could talk a little bit more about why that comes to be and what some of the challenges are there.
Sure, and I'd love to hear what my colleagues think of this too, because I don't know, can I say we're of different academic generations? Is that maybe? Yeah, disability studies is an interdisciplinary endeavor. On a real basic level and interdisciplinary in the same way as women's and gender studies, sexuality studies, various racial studies groups that grew out of both activism and academics. To me, the key of disability studies is that it uses disability as both a topic and an analytic. Just as, for example, people are more familiar with women's or gender studies, right, may use that as a topic, but also as an analytic to understand, as Debanuj said, forms of power, right, and power structures, relations of power. So disability studies can, in essence, look at any topic. I really believe that we can look at any topic and use disability as an analytic or supposed able-bodiedness as an analytic to better understand what it is we're looking at. So certainly there are some universities, colleges around the globe who have majors, minors, formal places with tenure track lines. Others are a little bit more fluid and working through that. You're all invited to take our graduate certificate from the University of Toledo. It is absolutely lovely, very interdisciplinary project. But I think it's an exciting place to be right now. And I'll just leave open the space for others to say. what they think.
One thing I would say in sort of helping to build the BA and then the master's program here at UT is there's always this constant tension between why does disability studies have to live in a university? That's one of the most exclusive places that you can do this work that supposedly is about inclusion and power, right? And that's a constant tension, right? That's like, what the heck am I doing if not actually reaching the majority of the disabled world's population, which is not in the United States and which is not in academia, certainly, right? And I think we have to wrestle with that every day and sort of thinking about, well, what are our research questions and why? And it's like, oh, I could do a research question that might get a lot of attention because it's trendy and like interesting, but the only people that are going to read that are like 50 other scholars who pick up a Duke University Press book. No, I mean, I read Duke University Press books, but like, you know what I mean? Like, what does it mean to produce an academic book? And the people that you did the research with aren't going to read that academic book, right? And that's hard. That's really hard. I wrote an academic book and none of the people I did field research with are going to read that academic book, right? And so thinking about as a feminist scholar, like, well, what do we do with that? And how do we create systems that are beneficial to the people that we're working with, right? And so, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm doing a film that I'm doing, because I know I can reach a different population with that film, and then doing other community projects with that work. But doing disability studies in the academy is completely and totally, well, it's full of tension. I was gonna say it's like hypocritical, but I don't know that it's hypocritical, but you know, it's hard. It's hard. Yeah. So, and doing it, oh, I was just gonna say, and we made a choice of doing it at a public university that's very affordable as compared to doing it somewhere like Harvard, right? Which wouldn't get anybody.
Yeah, and so, I mean, I think these are very important points that both of you are raising in terms of history of ideas and the sort of limits and joys of institutional recognition, much like the proximity to the nation state that some of us want to imagine as a remedy of, you know, disability, quote unquote, in that sense. But I mean, I want to add to that, I think what the sort of paradox of institutionalized sort of disability studies, queer crip studies. I also want to add a caution to the sort of cool, you know, sort of brand that queer crip studies has become, you know, and the way it is kind of brandied out, you know, sort of in humanities, in social sciences, in my field, as sort of this, oh, you're doing queer crip studies, oh my God, wow, that's like the latest thing, you know, to talk about. And so while the university fetishizes these, you know, near forms of knowledge production, you know, I am getting inundated with emails for accommodation, you know, for multiple students with very little actual support or services backed up at, you know, what we call a public Ivy today. If I have to sort of create a hierarchy even of public institutions, right? That, you know, where is your money going, right? You're propping up scholars, you know, many of us embodying certain kinds of queer cripness or certain abilities or not, as these kind of, you know, scholarship that is cutting edge, scholarship in social science, informing policy, we have to do public facing work, you know, all this amazing stuff that is more work for the crip body, and then actually put the crip body to work and actually traffic the crip body in actually creating accommodation and additional work, a project that I'm politically committed to, but it's actually a privatization of accommodation that happens via the professor, right? And happens via the professor just with the pandemic in our home space, where in our private space, it's like a deeper level of privatization. The university doesn't pay me for my internet, you know, Wi-Fi. I mean, maybe, you know, I cannot claim Wi-Fi on taxes anymore. So this very deeper level of, you know, sub-franchising cost and service is another paradox I want to introduce, you know, and disability studies scholars are talking about that, right? We are doing that activism on campus in terms of pushing this neoliberal service mode, this lip service of, as if writing a note to me, as if, you know, emailing me and checking in with me, you know, is the be all and end all of access. You know, when actually note takers are, you know, are not available as much, silent spaces where people can sit down and take exams without you know, distractions, you know, are always overbooked, you know, and then disability accommodation within graduate students, forget it. You know, it's like graduate students somehow magically have to overcome their, you know, diverse abilities and fit into a specific model of graduate education, right? So I think I want to add to that paradox, but I think that is precisely something disability studies has also picked up, and what I want to call the disability praxis, right? This dynamic exchange that Ali and Kim are pointing out in Ali's work, especially the dynamic exchange between theory and activism, right? And
yeah, sorry, Deb. I was also just thinking, I feel like I just sounded so negative just now about the academy, and I don't mean to sound as negative as it did. And I was just thinking, one of the things that we're going to be in tension with in terms of the academy being a place where we can actually do this work, right? And we have the resources to do this work and the incredible privilege to do this work, but we're up against something like here in Ohio, the divisive content bill, right? In the Ohio House that is going up on Monday. Are they talking about it? So that's really hard and really scary, because what we do is divisive content, like everything that we do. I mean, we talk about eugenics, right? We talk about, and what's kind of also scary is that we're not going to be pointed out first as disability studies scholars, because people are going to think, oh, you're disability studies scholars, that's like special education, like that's fine. You're not, you know, our feminist friends, our Africana studies friends are, you know, those are going to be the people that are pointed out first, and until they find us, until they're eliminated, and then they finally realize what disability studies does, and then we're also sort of hacked at the hip. So like, I think it's a really scary time and a really important time because of these divisive content bills all over the country and in Ohio to push back and to do this work. And especially if we can do it in the university and they cut it out of K through 12, right? In New Hampshire, they passed a law that says like basically people can sue teachers independently, right? Individuals can sue teachers of social studies if they're teaching divisive content, right? It's like a vigilante, like, yes, sue your teacher who makes $30,000 a year for teaching about, you know, Nazism, right? But that's like the world that we're living in. So I think it's also a really important moment to do what we're doing.
I'm going to sound so much more boring than everybody else right now, but I also think disability studies is at a very specific developmental phase as a field. That is, you know, when African American studies, for example, feminist studies came to be, they rethought pedagogy and ways that influenced all of the academy, but also that at the very beginning, they were, you know, women's and gender studies programs were expected to solve all issues related to women's and gender on campus. And students and faculty and staff would expect that. And that was heavy labor. And the same, I think, you know, for Chicana studies programs, others, they were expected to solve all things related to that topic on campus. And right now, I think as disability studies grows, there are ways in which we are expected to solve all things disability on campus. You know, I've realized as chair that the external world does not always distinguish between disability studies and disability services, and that disability studies faculty carry a lot of the burdens of the stories that they are told. And I think that's a developmental process in these fields that has happened with other fields.
Thanks for that, Kim. I'm curious, as you start to think about college students who are coming to campus, who are learning about disability history, about activism, how does that help them understand themselves and the different experiences of their bodies that they might be bringing to your classes?
I think it helps exponentially. I don't know what else to say, but all of us come to classes with our body minds. We don't leave them behind. They are with us, and the body minds of everyone we love and live with is with us in the classroom. And for some of us, the body minds of some of our ancestors long gone are with us in the classroom. And so I think regardless of what our students study, regardless of their career goals, that is all with them and with us in the classroom. And when we pay attention to disability, it transforms them and their lives and the way that they live out and feel the body minds of themselves as well as those of others.
Can I interrupt you really quickly, Kim? You used the terminology of body mind, and can you just give the folks who are not as familiar with that a sense of what you mean by that term?
Sure, and I certainly am happy for the other two of you to jump in here. Disability studies scholars, I think in the beginning only use the word body, then began to add the word mind, and now in the last decade, particularly Margaret Price and Angela Carter have talked about merging those to talk about body, mind, and that with the argument that and the claim that these are not separate things, right? Our bodies and minds are joined and are one thing, interrelated, and inseparable. And maybe the rest of you can help me fill that out.
Yeah, resist the body-mind dualism. That's like the Western, Enlightenment idea. I think one thing too that happens in our classrooms is, students come out, right? They come out much in the same way queer students can find themselves coming out in gender studies classrooms. I think we have a similar kind of process that happens for a lot of our students. And then other students are sort of surprised to realize that they come to class thinking they don't know anybody with a disability, and they leave thinking everybody in their family has a disability, right? They start to see it everywhere, and that changes how they negotiate the world, right? And I think that's like pretty phenomenal once they realize like the stakes that are there. And I was talking to an older feminist studies colleague today, and she was talking about how if she ever gets to retire, what she would do. And I was like, man, I think at some point I'm just going to get to a place where I just want to like do yoga and be a birth worker and, blah, blah. And she was like, yeah, I should have done that. I should have done something more kinesthetic. I'm such a kinesthetic person. I don't know why I chose to be a professor. And I was like, but that's just it. You can be a kinesthetic teacher, but we haven't honored that. Right. And I think that's one thing that disability studies allows us to do, is to explore those pedagogical ways that we can use our kinesthetic knowledges that I think we're really in baby phases in terms of figuring out.
And I'm really, I'm with Kim and Ali. And Kim, thank you for pointing this pedagogical moment in this, sort of developmentist moment of disability studies, if we want to go think that way. And I'm so with you on that, because, one has to think through what are the alternatives for students with different capacities. And then if I take away the word alternatives, because if I follow, I'll date myself, I come from a longer thinking around sexualities where queer sexualities were called alternative sexualities, right? So if we get away from the term alternative and we think about what is assignment for different kinds of students, right? And like, what if, like today, one of my teaching assistants wrote to me and said, a specific student has been present in every discussion section and being very active, but hasn't turned in the 150 word weekly reflections, right? My first thought was like, oh, I used to be that student. My second thought then was, okay, if you are orally participating and if you have brought your body, mind to the Zoom space and you've participated, you get full points for being there. What if you didn't write 150 words? I mean, you were showing work in a different way. Your outcome was very different. So, I mean, I think we really have to rethink outcome and assignment in the classroom. And I think the body, mind, sensation is welcome in my classroom. I actually have students do, autobiographical reflection exercises. They're just like 1 to 2 pages based on certain readings. I have certain prompts that makes you think about your own life, or connect with your life experience with the reading. And students go like really deep, right? Around capacity, around, desire, sexuality, sexual violence. There's a lot of sort of confessional narrative, a lot of narrative moments that come out where students are, trying to sort of find a space for that, right? And I think students come to our classrooms looking for that space more and more as, services are lesser, are performative through wearing badges and waving flags. Students will come to our classrooms in queer, crip, feminist, you name it, Africana, Asian American, Indigenous studies, seeking that embodied space, seeking a refuge where I could narrate this and make a connection with knowledge production. And I think part of the disability pedagogy is to make that connection. So, I'm always very inspired by Audre Lorde. I always teach women of color, as Ali knows, and I'm always teaching some of these women of color, like June Jordan, Some of Us Did Not Die, like relates to your question of like, how can we think of activism, right? How people have come together. I always teach these scholars as a way of allowing my students to see that, autobiographical narrative is not a second degree or a lower degree of abstraction or knowledge production, that actually through my life, body, mind, sensation, I can reach, a form of knowledge production. So I'll just stop there around that question.
No, thank you so much. I want to make sure we have some time for folks in the audience to ask questions. Thank you for indulging me as I put my questions to you. And so I know, Sonia, you had a question. Do you want to start us out? And then anyone else who has questions, please put it in the chat and we'll call on you.
Thank you, Ashley. First of all, thank you, Kim, Debanuj, and Ali for being here. I had a question for Ali. So you mentioned about the Ukraine issue, right? So I'm a secretary for the International Club on campus, and we recently, like yesterday, we held a gathering just to show support that the OVO community stands with the people. When I posted it on Instagram, I got a lot of hate for it. I posted some stories and I'm an international student, I'm from India, and my friends literally asked me, oh, do you even know the history between Ukraine and Russia? And I was like, yes, I have read about it, but at the same time, people are dying. And you mentioned that, how people are migrating. That's also a creative, a sort of disability status, because again, it's moving from one place to another. And then Russia took over Chernobyl, and we all know about the Chernobyl incident that happened, and that we're still suffering from the consequences from the mutations. So how do you deal with that? We were just trying to do something just to show support. We didn't even have anything, and when I posted on my stories, I got this much hate, like, why are you supporting it? I mean, I understand your political view, but at the same time, people are dying, right? Can I just like not stand up for that? Can I just not light a candle? Can I just not get a flower? So what do you have to say about that? I just want to hear your perspective.
I think you should keep doing what you're doing, right? And I think it boggles my mind that there would be hate coming at you for posting something that you're organizing in support of peace or in support of the people of Ukraine. And I mean, I think it sort of depends on what it is that you're supporting, right? Is it that you think war is a problem? Is it that you think the Russian takeover of Ukraine specifically is a problem? I mean, there's so many angles of like why you might want to show your support. And I think that all you can do is sort of do your organizing and focus on what your points are, right? To say like, so maybe you're like a disability justice activist. Maybe you're an activist who is actually LGBTQ activist, and you're like, well, listen, this is what we know about what's happening with LGBTQ people in the Ukraine right now and what they're scared about happening, right? Or like, I think there's like, so, man, I don't know. I'm just like pissed that happened to you. I don't think I have anything brilliant to say except that like keep doing the organizing and try not, I feel like it's really important not to engage a lot of negativity in those online spaces because it can zap your energy so much. Focus on building the coalition with the people who are open and willing. And that's what I feel like you can do. I don't know. Kim and Deb, you probably have way more brilliant and insightful things to say.
I have checked out of Twitter, to be honest. And I mean, I only like post pictures on Instagram, and I post quite a lot on Facebook. So that again tells you the age group that I'm in. My students tell me, they don't know to think, you know, who reads, like who's on Facebook? Like people above 50 are on Facebook. I was like, what? 10 years ago it was 40, but I guess, yes, it is people above, you know. So it's like, you know, social media is also very, you know, the age-based participation. But for me, Twitter is, you know, it really sort of messes with my, you know, with sort of, you know, synaptic claps, you know, sort of things of my, you know, the way my brain function. I cannot take Twitter. It, you know, as a survivor of trauma, having PTSD, you know, PTSD, Twitter kind of makes me paranoid. It sort of really feeds into that. So I stay away from Twitter. That's my only answer I can give. It helps me with my sanity. I also think that, you know, but I do think you should keep doing what you're doing because you're disturbing people's horizon. And I don't know your friends, whether they're located here or these are friends from India. Oh yeah, it's a whole different geopolitics we're talking about. There is a huge, I mean, the Hindu fascism, the Hindutva fascism, not Hindu fascism, Hindutva fascism, the shift in geopolitics, you know, and the realignment of India with this newer form of Russia, the realignment of India with Israel is huge. So, you know, my Indian friends, even critical friends, read Russia's aggression, the war in Ukraine, as Eastern countries, as a post-socialist country who has been messed with NATO and the US making a response, right? And sort of Ukraine as this example of liberal democratic modernism that America embodies. So it's really deeply problematic the way Indians on social media have taken up actually, you know, a form of fascist global geopolitics that actually sides with Putin, a lot of them, because it is in some you know, some way it is they're trying to pass it as a critique of the West, a critique of US, and it's dangerous. It's violent. It's dangerous. It's related to how Hindutva is atmospheric in India right now.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I have another question from the chat. We have Jacob, and he says he's a student teaching in a US history class at the moment, and they're coming to the end of their civil rights unit and have a day to cover the movement for increased disability rights in the 60s and 70s. And so he's curious, are there specific events you wished you'd learned when you were in school?
Kim, you should lead on that.
I'm just trying to decide if I want to say an event that'll make you all feel good or an event that'll make you all want to go home and cry. Because we could go either way.
Let's do both.
Okay, the sad one, then the happy one. The huge what if that always haunts me is that after World War II in the early 1950s, there are two arms of the federal government that came to battle as to which would have control of all things disability, basically. Would it be the Department of Labor, who was all about getting people to work, these kinds of things, or would it be the Department of Social Services and Social Work and helping the unfortunate? Human Social Services won out in that battle, and everything disability was put there. And to me, I think that's such a pivotal moment of what would have happened to US disability policy if it had gone under the Department of Labor. That talked about labor access and ensuring access to people with all kinds of bodies and minds and body minds to employment. I don't know, but that's the moment that always haunts me of what if, what could have happened. But a good moment. I would find a civil rights movement that does not happen in California. And I'm really, really sorry to those of you from California, but there is life in the rest of the US or what came the US. And, the disability activism of, there's a time in Minnesota in the 1950s where labor unions sought to organize what were then called sheltered workshops by unions. Can you imagine? To me, that's so fascinating. I'll forgive you, Debanuj. The moments of advocacy around Section 504 and the Rehabilitation Act, or the ways that I think there are some disabled activists and parents and teachers who worked together to transform education in the 70s, particularly, I discovered a moment in my own work of a disability rights activist in Minneapolis, St. Paul, who was a wheelchair user, largely quadriplegic. She was raped in her apartment, traumatic. Okay, at that point, Minnesota law, rape law required proof of physical resistance to prosecute rape. They found the guy, he did right. The woman was quadriplegic, she had not physically resisted, and so the perpetrator got off the hook. But because of her activism, she brought together the feminist community, the disability rights community, and they totally transformed rape law in Minnesota. Mm-hmm. And that's a moment of coalition, right, which Ali talked about so well at the beginning. And I think those moments of coalitions and learning are really important.
I also just wanted to add, I wonder what your goals are in the unit, because sometimes I like to use those very short units that you have to teach something about how to do resistance, right? And so like that, the example that you just gave, Kim, is a really great example of coalition. I was just thinking like if you teach about ADAPT, right, as like the bus boycotts. So that's interesting, one, because you can find some footage and the kids like their YouTube, right? But also because it's an interesting moment where they stayed focused on such a relatively small thing. And then they created tactics that were super logical to address that thing, right? They laid down in front of buses and they used what they had, right? Which was they had bodies that would get a lot of media attention if they were going to be roughed up by the police, because people would be like, oh, you can't beat up a disabled person. So they used that in their favor, right? So they took a stereotype and they used it in their favor. They had very specific points of what they needed to happen, and they got the media attention, and eventually they got sort of what they needed. So I don't think that's the most amazing moment in disability history, but I think it teaches us something about how to do activism, especially when you don't have the kind of body that can do resistance in the way that we have learned resistance must look, right? So, and I think you could do it in like 45 minutes. So if that's all you got, I think you can do it in 45 minutes.
I just want to quickly say, you could also talk about the Tuskegee, airmen between 1932 and 1972. We all know the testing of syphilis by the U.S. Health and Human Services. And I think sort of the impairing of the Black man's body and sort of, always rendering the Black body as a medical sort of, as an object for labor, as an object for producing certain kind of value. And then the ultimately, like what the US state does in the 90s in just apologizing to the men, is not a good example. It's not a victory example, but it is an example of how, the civil rights movement is, the Civil Rights Act has been passed by 1972, but this is still continuing, right? So, I mean, I think it sort of also will help you show a richer history of what we mean by civil rights in the US, right?
Those are great answers. Thank you. Do we have other questions?
Can I ask one?
Sonia, can I turn to Carlin Crowley, who has not yet asked a question, and then we'll come back to you so everybody gets a chance.
I want to make sure Sonia gets her question too. So thank you so much for this concept of the body mind, which is so important to me and that I understand as a white woman, as a feminist scholar through womanism. And I want to ask you a question about the body mind. So in hiring faculty, this is also something my previous institution, which was actually a religious institution, and I'm at a secular institution, allowed as a question. I start by saying, I have a heart question, and I touch my heart, not a head question. I have a heart question. Why do you do what you do? Why do you love the thing you love? What brought you to this field? And in asking that question of potential faculty, they have gasped. They have said, nobody's asked me that. I never asked that. They're sort of overcome by this notion that they would get to bring their whole selves into a job interview and tell the story of why they do the thing they do. And I wanted to ask, are there moments for you where the body mind or that approach of an integrated sense of being whole and what you do would be welcome, or you see as an intervention in higher ed when the body and mind are so often bifurcated?
This is perhaps a sideways answer to your question. Some of you know, I'm taking classes right now just because I need that for my heart and my head and my heart. But one of my professors with the beginning of the pandemic has started out every class with a poem. And our class has nothing to do with poems, it's property law. And that hearing that a short poem at the beginning of every class has, I think, been really important for the body mind of all of us as we have, I don't want to say survived the pandemic, as we've waded our way through and got stuck in it.
Mm. I like that question. It's Carlin? Is that how you say your name, Carlin? I like that question because I always want to know people's motivation for why they're doing what they're doing, right? And that's essentially kind of what you're asking. And I've often prepared for that question myself, but I'm also very cognizant of wanting to protect myself, right? So if someone comes at me with that and they're looking for some personal disclosure, I'm going to be like very sort of steely about it, right? And I think that that's a tricky line, right? Because it's like, are you asking me to like come out to you about sort of personal experiences and personal identities, or like the person in that interview has to sort of negotiate the power relations and then figure out what can I say that keeps me safe, but also is, authentic, is going to be understood, is going to be real. And that takes a lot of thinking in advance. And I think a lot of us, especially if we do quote unquote identity studies, we've thought that through because that is a question that you get. It's sometimes not as directly as what you're asking, right? And I was just on the search committee for our Vice Provost of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And one of the questions we asked was, what's your motivation for this job? And 9 times out of 10, there was a personal sort of narrative that they would sort of talk about. And when someone didn't offer that, the committee was like, I don't know, I don't get why they're invested. I don't get it, I don't trust them, right? And then you have to sort of step back and be like, whoa, what are my expectations around disclosure here, right? And so I think it's super tricky. I think it's a great question, but I think it's something that I also talk to my students about when they're going on the job market, because they always want to know about disclosure. And I have them think very seriously about what they're willing to say and why, and then sort of help them think about what their narratives are, right? So that they can protect themselves as much as they feel comfortable doing. So I think it's really hard.
Thank you, Ali. I have more to say. I want to hear what other folks have to say, but I have more to say about the sort of meta moment that you went to. I appreciate that, because I also say you do not have to disclose. I have a whole disclaimer about my question, in fact, and still people are overcome because they aren't asked. So maybe in some of your contexts they're asked, but generally in higher ed, that is not a question. I think it's a softball question, but mostly people are overcome by the fact that they aren't asked why they love or do the thing they do, which I think is really profound.
I think assuming you're still the provost, I think all provosts should be as conscientious, loving, and exciting and conscientious like you in asking that kind of a question. I mean, it's somebody I would rather have a dean ask me that question in an interview than ask me, do you see yourself getting a $2 million NSF grant in the next 5 years? That's often asked, right? I mean, in social sciences, especially, but I think the question of that you're gesturing towards is like, what is the spirit, something with the body mind, through the body mind, but beyond the body mind, right? What is the terror, hunger, and rage with which I wake up every day in the morning and I say, oh, I'm going to teach this today. Oh, I'm going to write about this today. Or this is what I'm going to say on the hiring committee today, even though I don't have tenure yet, right? So what is the terror, hunger, and rage that sort of, with which I come to the world, I think is a very, very beautiful question. And I wish more provosts and deans asked that question with the kind of, conscientious framing that you're giving.
So, well, thank you. Listen, my office is, in any administrative role is super complicated, and higher ed is a really challenged sector, and no power is innocent, right? All those things are true. But I was really interested in, because I think it is so hard how you bring your whole selves into the thing that you do, and where are there interventions where you're able to do that. And I hope that question invites more people into our community as they know it as a liberal arts institution, but I don't know, you try to make an intervention where you can, it's small, it's humble. So I'm interested in what you do too, as your interventions.
I'm just very quickly going to say one thing is, actually the flip side of the question is, what if I don't want to bring my whole self to this job? And actually I don't bring my whole self to this job. What I do bring is as much as what aspect of me can I authentically bring to this job without having to fake my whole self being here? Does that make sense? Like what aspect of me is truly loving being here and enjoying being here without having to bring my whole self? I don't even know if I have a whole self. This is one of the reasons I narrate a lot about, quote unquote, my personal experiences to undo myself. Because, but I have to admit that I have to continue, a somewhat functional being, with some serenity and energy the next morning. And for me, bringing my entirety to academia is a dangerous project. I would not survive. And it's not just the academic institution and its limits, but it's also the ego investment as an academic into my work. It's not the be all and end all of my work. I have social relations, I have friendships, I have love and heartbreak, investments in, in social movements that do not want to be codified in knowledge making. I like being out in nature. I like crying sitting on the ocean. And, one could read that time as like time wasted from my writing, right? So, I mean, in some sense, I don't want to bring my whole self to this job, but I often think of, when I am entering this institution, what part of me can authentically be here and work with joy rather than like working from paranoia and exhaustion, because that will come. But if I approach that with joy and some amount of authenticity, whatever that means, it'll help me endure and persevere and like get through those difficult times.
If
I'm
I
going to interrupt. Go ahead, Kim.
You sure? Okay. I was thinking that bringing both what Ali said and Carlin together, it brings up questions about identity politics and disability. And obviously this is really complicated, right? But, at least where I am today, and this may change very soon, my students often want to insist that all of their disability studies professors have gone through some sort of disability trauma and thus we're there, right? They think about this with all sorts of supposed identity academic programs. And I'm not willing to go there, and I don't want to go there. And, there are days when I just want to say, look, this is a really interesting intellectual endeavor that will have immense impact on your professional career, and you don't get to know anything about me. And in some ways, right, this is all about body minds, but even if you were some little body mindless being, this is still an important intellectual endeavor that is going to help you in the universe. And so I think it's this real tension, if we can go back to that, between the very specificity of experience with also the large, this is really something worth doing and that everyone should care about, regardless of whether or not this is part of your identity.
Thank you for that, Kim. I want to make sure we don't lose your question, Sanya, to come back to you. And if there are others who have other questions, please just raise your hand or let me know. Or
Thank you. That question really got me thinking a lot of things, because as a rising senior, I'm applying for internships right now. And Ali, you mentioned that your students ask about it. And recently I was going through a list of interview questions. And again, one of the questions was, oh, why did you decide to choose this career? And I was literally thinking that, oh, the day I decided it will fetch me good money. Like, I don't know, when I got into it, like it's because I want money. But I also felt like, oh, if I don't give them a story from my childhood that so I'm a CS major that got me into it, I might not get it because they might not relate with me, or like something that I need to indulge the recruiters on some grounds with me on why they can hire me when they have 200 more applicants for the same job, even with the same skills. So that was a great question. I had a similar question, but from a student's perspective. And as a STEM major, I'm taking a class in women and gender studies for the very first time with Professor Chisebe. I actually did the summer bridge program, which is for the first year students transitioning into college. They come into school early with Professor Chisebe. And when I was registering for like the spring, I was like, okay, I do want to do something out of taking just CS classes or econ or math, because I am done. And I went to this first class. I wasn't even sure of how I'm going to do it or not. But those conversations, they're still in my head. And Professor Chisebe is just amazing. She's like, there's nothing right or wrong in my class. It's all about perspective. So my question is that University of Toledo is big, like it's a public university, it's huge. So what incentive do students like me have to take a class in that, take a class in disability section, or in some other interdisciplinary major? Maybe if it's not their major, or students who like want to major in those majors without even knowing that these exist. So what is it like from their perspective?
So Sonia, you're asking, what does computer science students, what might be the incentive for them to learn more about disability in order to, and what might that get them in other areas?
Exactly, any incentive.
I can answer that. I just had this conversation with a computer science major, actually, who's going to do a minor with us. And so there's some practical things, right? So one of the practical things is you get to learn about digital access. And that's actually a job in terms of creating digital access, whether it's websites, gaming, apps, etc. Right? So it's actually just a technical skill that is awesome to have. And then understanding disability culture helps you to like open up and anticipate needs that people would want with technology, because disabled people are like some of the most active technology users, right? They go to technology and develop technology out of necessity, right? And then the rest of us are like, oh, that's pretty cool, I'm gonna like use that too, right? So those are like two practical things. And then sort of from a maybe slightly less practical side, it sets you apart, right? In the sense of there aren't going to be a lot of like double majors or minors in disability studies because there's not a lot of programs out there. So if you want to differentiate yourself in the pile, right, then that's one way to do it. We also, I mean, some of our classes count towards the multicultural ed requirement that we have, right? So it can also be core for some people as well. But then I also like to think of disability studies and like things within the College of Arts and Letters at our university as we're not training you for a particular job where you're going to make $70,000, $80,000 a year from the outset, right? But we are teaching you how to think and think really in really interesting and different ways and giving you different lenses. And we can't anticipate the jobs that will be available in 10 years. So the example I like to give, and this will date me, was when I was graduating from college. I was a double major in poli-sci and creative writing. And a lot of my creative writing friends were going off to be poor, writers and work in coffee shops, etc. And it was 2004. And 5 years later, they were many of them, not all of them, were making pretty good money doing this job that hadn't existed when we graduated. And that was being a social media outreach coordinator, because Facebook had just launched in 2004, right? Now, 20 years later, that's a job. And my friends were on the ground floor. I was not. I was doing stupid social service work with children. I don't know what I was thinking. But right, they were so those jobs didn't exist. Our professors couldn't have trained us for that. But they got in on the ground floor because they were flexible thinkers and creative and able to sort of think outside the box. And that's what I think programs like disability studies and gender studies really do for you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm mindful that we're at 8:30 on a Thursday evening, and I just want to give one more sort of call to ask if anybody else has a question. And if so, we'll take one last question. And if not, we will, I'll suggest that we wrap up for the night.
I have a statement and then a small question. I want to piggyback off of what Ali said in terms of a lucrative job. It is a niche job that is not enough people doing the accessible technology piece. You could really make a name for yourself in that area. Huge, huge, huge shout out about that. There just isn't enough people doing that job. The other thing, real quick, is how can me as an accessibility services coordinator doing the work day to day in the university connect with these scholars, and how can we make a difference working together?
I think that one way professors, others in higher ed and education in general need to work with disability services people and vice versa is to think about disability justice beyond compliance.
Right.
And we will only get that done if we work together on that issue. That we really need to work together on that issue. And I think we can dream bigger together about that issue.
Yeah, I mean, you know, like Jedi initiatives will come and go, right? But you and I will sort of, you know, will remain overworked in many ways. And I think to think beyond compliance between the educator, administrator, and the accessibility coordinator, we could think of it as a different paradigm that is not around compliance or fear of being sued. You know, the language of access. We could think of like creating community with each other. We could think of, you know, like for instance, if I just took the disability coordinator advocate who's writing to me for the student, you know, 1 week before the end of the quarter as my chosen enemy, you know, none of us would get anywhere. I mean, you know, I mean, at an R1 institution, at a major R1 institution, like some of this at the last moment, one could read as a chosen enemy, because like my priority is somewhere else, or I'm being told like what percentage of my contract is teaching, right? And so, you know, one thinks in these really strange ways often, because we have to we take up our job responsibilities. But to undo that is to think of ourselves as a community that enables each other and the student, right? So for me, it was a moment of like, pause, like, don't go to the place of this is a drain on my time. But like the advocate is reaching out, and like, let's think of what is creative pedagogical moment at this point, what works. So I think like, I think really thinking of ourselves as a community with as many limitations as possible across power hierarchies, you know, thinking or investing in friendships, you know, as a way of undercutting the way the institution operates or thinks of us, you know, could be a way of, you know, disabling the academic industrial complex.
I would say,
Thank you for that. Just so you know, oh, sorry, Allie. Go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say a practical thing is I created a disability justice advisory board on campus. So our compliance people are in there, but it's a ton of people from all over campus. Some people who are parenting disabled kids, other people who are disabled themselves. And we just got together last year and we just dreamed big, like what are our big dreams? And I think this just doing that can get a lot of different voices in the room and really like sort of, and you can realize who your allies are, right? Like on campus to do the work, right? So that's all.
Thank you for that. I just want to say, for those of you that are Ohio Wesleyan, have received an email from me 1 week before the end of the semester because they haven't seen, the student hasn't been to class in the last 4 weeks. That being said, I get where you're coming from. Thank you.
So thanks so much for everybody coming out tonight. This has been a really rich discussion. It's been such a pleasure to have you all here together to respond to each other, to share ideas, to pick up in different places. And I just am really grateful for that richness that you've brought with all your voices. And thank you again for folks joining us. I know you took almost 2 hours out of your evening on a Thursday, and I hope you've taken away as much from this as we have. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. And thank you, Dawn, for reaching out.
Thank you,
Thanks,
John, for
everyone.
reaching out, and thank you everybody for being here.
And
What
thanks to our
pleasure.
interpreters
And thank you, interpreters.
and our captioner.
Yes. Thank you all. And with that, I'm going to end the meeting. Good night.
Night.
Night. So nice to meet you.